At the age of 15, while other girls were enjoying their carefree youth, Emily faced a life-changing shock. She became pregnant unexpectedly. But what hurt her the most was being abandoned by her own family. With no place to go and no one to turn to, Emily was forced to embark on a difficult journey to find hope and rebuild her life. During her darkest days, she received help from strangers with kind hearts, and from those struggles, Emily rose above her circumstances to become a resilient mother and a successful entrepreneur, earning the admiration of everyone around her. This is a story of perseverance, kindness, and the power of forgiveness, a story that will touch your heart. At just 15 years old, Emily's life took a turn she never expected. Sitting alone in the corner of her small bedroom, she clutched a pregnancy test in her trembling hands. The two bold lines on the test stared back at her, confirming her worst fears. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process what this meant for her future. Her heart raced, and her mind was flooded with questions she couldn't answer. How could this have happened? What would she do now? But as overwhelming as the thought of becoming a mother at such a young age was, it wasn't the thing that scared her the most. What truly terrified her was how her parents would react. Emily had always been a quiet, obedient daughter. She grew up in a strict household where appearances and reputation meant everything. Her parents, especially her mother, had high expectations for her. They dreamed of her excelling in school, going to college, and making the family proud. But now, all of that seemed impossible. She knew that this news would shatter their expectations and bring shame to the family in their eyes. The sound of the front door slamming shut jolted Emily out of her thoughts. Her parents were home. She quickly hid the pregnancy test in her drawer, but her hands were still shaking. She could hear their voices downstairs, talking about their day. For a moment, she considered keeping the secret to herself, but she knew it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Her growing belly would eventually betray her. Taking a deep breath, she decided to tell them the truth, hoping, praying, that they would understand and support her. As she walked down the stairs, her legs felt like they were made of lead. Her parents were sitting in the living room, her father reading the newspaper and her mother scrolling through her phone. Emily stood in the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you." Her mother looked up, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "What is it, Emily? You look pale." Emily hesitated, her throat dry. I'm pregnant." The room fell silent. Her father slowly lowered his newspaper, his face unreadable. Her mother's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, Emily thought she might faint. Then the shouting began. "How could you do this to us?" her mother screamed, her voice shaking with anger. "You've ruined our family's reputation. Do you have any idea what people will say about us, about you?" Her father stood up, his face red with fury. "You're no longer our daughter," he said coldly. "Pack your things and leave. If you can't respect this family, then you don't belong here." Emily's heart broke into a million pieces. She had expected them to be upset, but she never imagined they would disown her. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to plead with them. "Please, I didn't mean for this to happen. I need your help. I can't do this alone." But her parents wouldn't listen. Her mother turned her back on her, and her father pointed to the stairs. "Go, now!" Feeling utterly defeated, Emily went back to her room and packed a small bag with whatever she could fit. Clothes, a toothbrush, a photo of her and her younger brother from happier times. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she zipped up her bag, she glanced around her room one last time. This had been her safe space, her sanctuary, but now it felt like a prison she was being forced to leave. The rain was pouring down as Emily stepped out of the house. She didn't have an umbrella, and within minutes, she was soaked to the bone. The cold rain mixed with her tears as she walked aimlessly through the dark streets. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Where would she sleep tonight? How would she take care of herself, let alone a baby? The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound being the rain hitting the pavement. Emily felt completely alone in the world. She thought about her friends, but she knew she couldn't go to them. Their parents would never allow it, and she didn't want to burden anyone with her problems. She thought about going to a shelter, but the idea of being surrounded by strangers scared her. For the first time in her life, she truly felt like she had no one to turn to. As she walked, her mind kept replaying her parents' words. "You're no longer our daughter." The pain of their rejection was almost unbearable. She had always looked up to them, always tried to make them proud. And now, in her moment of greatest need, they had turned their backs on her. She wondered if they would ever forgive her, or if she could ever forgive them. Hours passed, and Emily's legs grew tired. She found a bench in a small park and sat down, her clothes still damp from the rain. She hugged her bag to her chest, trying to keep warm. The park was empty, and the silence was deafening. She closed her eyes, hoping to block out the world, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too full of worries and fears. As the night dragged on, Emily began to feel the weight of her situation. She was just a teenager, still a child herself in many ways, and yet she was about to become a mother. The responsibility felt overwhelming. She didn't know how she would provide for her baby, how she would give them the life they deserved. But despite her fear, there was a small spark of determination inside her. She didn't know where it came from, but it was there, whispering to her that she couldn't give up. She had to keep going for her baby's sake. The first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the park. Emily looked up at the sky, her face pale and tired, but her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to face it head on. She couldn't let this be the end of her story. It was only the beginning. This expanded introduction sets the stage for Emily's journey, delving deeply into her emotions, her family's reaction, and the challenges she faces as she steps into an uncertain future. It captures the pain of rejection, the fear of the unknown, and the first glimmers of hope that will drive her story forward. Here's a 1,000-word expanded version of the scene, written in English. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Emily found herself walking aimlessly through the streets. The cold wind bit at her skin, and the weight of her small bag felt heavier with every step. Her clothes were still damp from the rain the night before, and her shoes squelched with every step. She had no destination in mind, no plan, and no idea of what to do next. All she knew was that she couldn't go back home. The rejection from her parents echoed in her mind, their harsh words cutting deeper than any physical pain she had ever felt. The streets were bustling with people going about their day, but Emily felt invisible. She passed by cafes and restaurants, the smell of food wafting through the air and making her stomach growl. She hadn't eaten since the day before, and the hunger was beginning to make her feel lightheaded. She stopped in front of a small diner, staring through the window at the people inside. They were laughing, eating, and enjoying their meals, completely unaware of the girl standing outside, longing for just a small piece of what they had. Summoning her courage, Emily stepped inside. The warmth of the diner was a stark contrast to the cold outside, and for a moment she felt a glimmer of hope. She approached the counter, where a middle-aged woman in an apron was taking orders. "Excuse me," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible over the chatter of the customers. The woman looked up, her expression polite but impatient. "Yes? What can I get for you?" Emily hesitated, her hands trembling. I was wondering if you're hiring. I can work hard and I'll do anything you need." The woman's polite smile faded, replaced by a look of pity. She glanced at Emily's disheveled appearance, her damp clothes, and the small bag slung over her shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, shaking her head. "We're not hiring right now." Emily's heart sank. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I really need a job. I'll do anything." The woman sighed, her tone softening. "Look, I wish I could help, but you're just a kid. And, well..." Her eyes flicked to Emily's stomach, where the faintest hint of a baby bump was beginning to show. "You should be at home, not out here looking for work." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to nod. "Thank you anyway," she whispered before turning and walking out of the diner. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She tried a few more places, but the result was always the same. Too young, too inexperienced, too pregnant. By the time the sun began to set, Emily was exhausted. Her feet ached, her stomach growled, and her hope was dwindling. She found a small park and sat down on a bench, pulling her knees to her chest to keep warm. The park was quiet, with only a few people passing by. She watched as the sky turned from blue to orange to a deep, dark purple. The hunger in her stomach was a constant reminder of her situation, and she couldn't stop the tears that began to fall. As she sat there lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see an older man, probably in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and worn clothes. He was carrying a small paper bag, and his kind eyes met hers as he stopped in front of her. "You look like you need this more than I do," he said, holding out the bag. Emily stared at him, unsure of what to say. Inside the bag was a sandwich, simple but enough to make her mouth water. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice filled with both gratitude and suspicion. "You don't even know me." The man smiled, his expression gentle. "Because I've been where you are," he said. "And sometimes, a little kindness can save a life." Emily hesitated for a moment before taking the bag. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She unwrapped the sandwich and took a small bite, the taste of bread and cheese feeling like a feast after a day of hunger. The man sat down on the bench beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. "My name's Jack," he said, extending a hand. "Emily," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, Jack spoke. "You remind me of myself, you know. A long time ago, I had a family. A wife, a daughter. We had a nice house, good jobs, everything you could want. But I made some bad choices. Got into gambling, lost all our money. My wife left me, took my daughter with her. I haven't seen them in years." Emily looked at him, her heart aching for the man beside her. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been so hard." Jack nodded, his eyes distant. "It was. But I've learned to live with it, and I've learned that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way to keep going. You just have to find it." His words struck a chord with Emily. She thought about her own situation, about the baby growing inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't give up. Not for herself, and not for her child. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time, "for the sandwich, and for everything." Jack smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You'll be okay, kid. You're stronger than you think." As the night grew colder, Jack stood up, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said. "And remember, it's okay to ask for help. There are good people out there. You just have to find them." Emily watched as he walked away, disappearing into the darkness. She sat on the bench for a while longer, thinking about his words. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Jack's kindness had reminded her that she wasn't completely alone. There were people in the world who cared, even if they were strangers. And if Jack could keep going after everything he had been through, then so could she. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Emily stood up, clutching her bag tightly. She didn't have all the answers, but she had something she hadn't had before: determination. She would find a way to survive, for herself and for her baby, and no matter how hard it got, she wouldn't give up. This expanded version delves deeper into Emily's emotions, her struggles, and the impact of Jack's kindness, creating a vivid and emotional narrative. The morning sun cast a soft glow through the trees, illuminating the small street where food vendors were beginning their busy day. The sounds of street vendors calling out, the clatter of pots and pans, and the hum of passing vehicles created a lively scene. But for Emily, everything seemed distant and muted. The young girl with dark circles under her eyes and a gaunt face walked slowly along the crowded street. Her old, worn-out coat barely concealed her frail figure, and her growing belly made every step feel heavier. Emily hadn't eaten in 2 days. She had been surviving on water from public fountains, but the gnawing hunger in her stomach was becoming unbearable. As she passed by a small food stand, the aroma of hot soup and freshly baked bread made her stop in her tracks. She stood at a distance watching customers line up to buy food, her eyes filled with longing but also hesitation. She had no money, and the shame of being turned away again was too much to bear. Behind the food stand was an older woman, likely in her 60s, with neatly tied silver hair and a warm smile. This was Mrs. Grace, the owner of the breakfast stand. She was used to seeing many faces pass by each day, but the sight of the young girl standing quietly, her eyes filled with sadness and exhaustion, caught her attention. Gently, she called out, "Dear, come here. Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat?" Emily flinched, startled by the voice. She shook her head and tried to walk away, but her legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the curb, tears silently streaming down her face. Mrs. Grace quickly stepped out from behind her stand, carrying a steaming bowl of soup and a small piece of bread. She sat down beside Emily, placing the food in her hands. "Here, eat this. You look like you need it," Mrs. Grace said softly. Emily stared at the bowl, her hands trembling. She stammered, I don't have any money to pay you." Mrs. Grace smiled kindly, her eyes full of understanding. "That's all right, dear. You don't need to pay me. Just eat. You need it more than anyone else right now. Emily hesitated for a moment before taking the bowl. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as warmth spread through her body. It was the first meal she'd had in days, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small sense of relief. When she finished, she looked up at Mrs. Grace, her eyes red and filled with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she whispered. Mrs. Grace looked at her with gentle concern and asked, "You're so young, dear. Why are you out here all alone? What happened?" Emily lowered her head, trying to hold back her emotions, but the weight of everything she had been through was too much. Tears began to fall again as she told Mrs. Grace her story. She spoke of how her family had abandoned her when they discovered she was pregnant, of the days she had spent wandering the streets with nowhere to go, and of the fear that consumed her every time she thought about the future, for herself, and the baby she was carrying. Mrs. Grace listened intently, never interrupting, only nodding and holding Emily's hand when her voice broke. When Emily finished, Mrs. Grace spoke gently. "Life can be so cruel sometimes, but it doesn't always have to be the end of the road. If you don't mind, you can stay here and help me with my food stand. I don't have much, but at least you'll have a roof over your head and food to eat. What do you think?" Emily looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. She couldn't believe that a stranger would offer her such kindness. Her voice trembled as she replied, "Really? I can stay? I don't know how to thank you." Mrs. Grace smiled and patted Emily's shoulder. "There's no need to thank me, dear. Sometimes a little kindness is all we need to get through the hardest days. I believe you'll be all right." From that day on, Emily began working with Mrs. Grace. Every morning she woke up early to help prepare the food, learning how to cook soup, bake bread, and serve customers. The work was tiring, but Emily was grateful. For the first time in a long while, she had a place to call home. Mrs. Grace didn't just teach Emily how to work, she also taught her how to save money and manage her earnings. Each day, after the food stand closed, Mrs. Grace would hand Emily a small portion of the day's earnings and encourage her to save it for her baby. Emily took her advice to heart, carefully storing every coin in a small box that Mrs. Grace had given her. The days spent working with Mrs. Grace brought more than just stability to Emily's life. They brought her hope. Mrs. Grace often shared stories from her own life, about the struggles she had faced as a young widow raising her children alone. She spoke of loss, resilience, and the importance of never giving up. These stories became a source of inspiration for Emily, reminding her that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward. As time went on, Emily grew more confident in her work. She became familiar with the regular customers, who began to notice the hardworking young girl with the kind smile. Some of them even offered her old clothes or baby supplies, small gestures that meant the world to Emily. Through her time with Mrs. Grace, Emily learned not only how to survive but also how to face life with courage. She no longer felt as lost or hopeless as she once had. Instead, she began to dream of a better future for herself and her child. Mrs. Grace, with her patience and unwavering kindness, became like a second mother to Emily. She gave her more than just a roof over her head. She gave her the belief that life could still hold good things, even when everything seemed to have fallen apart. Emily knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but she no longer felt alone. With Mrs. Grace's support and the kindness of those around her, she believed she could overcome anything. This moment marked a turning point in Emily's life, a step toward a brighter future filled with hope and determination. The day Liam was born was both the most terrifying and the most beautiful day of Emily's life. The small hospital room was dimly lit with the faint hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses in the background. Emily lay on the hospital bed, her face pale and drenched in sweat, her body trembling from exhaustion. The labor had been long and painful, but when she finally heard the first cries of her baby, a wave of relief and overwhelming emotion washed over her. Tears streamed down her face as the nurse gently placed the tiny, wriggling bundle into her arms. Mrs. Grace stood by her side, holding Emily's hand tightly throughout the ordeal. Her presence had been a source of comfort and strength for Emily, who had no one else to turn to. As Emily cradled her newborn son, she looked up at Mrs. Grace with a weak but grateful smile. "Thank you for everything," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. Mrs. Grace smiled warmly, brushing a strand of damp hair from Emily's forehead. "You're stronger than you think, dear, and now you have a beautiful little boy to remind you of that every day." Emily gazed down at her son, his tiny fingers curling around hers. She decided to name him Liam, a name that symbolized her hope for him to have a peaceful and happy life, something she had always longed for but never truly experienced. In that moment, she silently vowed to do everything in her power to give Liam the life he deserved, no matter how hard it would be. The first few weeks after Liam's birth were some of the most challenging days of Emily's life. The small room she shared with Mrs. Grace above the food stand became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. Nights were sleepless, filled with Liam's cries and Emily's desperate attempts to soothe him. She quickly learned the exhausting routine of feeding, changing diapers, and rocking him to sleep, only to wake up a few hours later and start all over again. During the day, Emily continued to work at the food stand with Mrs. Grace. She would strap Liam to her chest in a makeshift baby carrier while she prepared food, served customers, and cleaned up. The customers, many of whom had grown fond of Emily, often stopped to coo at Liam or offer her words of encouragement. Some even brought small gifts, baby clothes, blankets, or toys, knowing how much she was struggling. Despite the support, there were moments when Emily felt completely overwhelmed. There were days when Liam wouldn't stop crying, and she couldn't figure out what was wrong. There were nights when she sat on the edge of her bed, holding him close and crying silently, wondering if she was strong enough to handle it all. But every time she looked into Liam's innocent, trusting eyes, she found the strength to keep going. His tiny smile, the way his fingers wrapped around hers, and the soft coos he made as he drifted off to sleep, reminded her why she couldn't give up. Mrs. Grace was a constant source of guidance and support. She would often take over the food stand for a few hours so Emily could rest or spend time with Liam. She taught Emily how to balance her responsibilities, how to manage her time, and most importantly, how to believe in herself. Being a mother is the hardest job in the world, Mrs. Grace would say, but it's also the most rewarding. You're doing great, Emily. Don't ever doubt that. As the months passed, Emily began to find her rhythm. She became more confident in her ability to care for Liam and manage her work at the food stand. She also started thinking about the future. She knew that working at the food stand alone wouldn't be enough to provide Liam with the life she wanted for him. She needed to learn new skills, to find a way to improve their circumstances. With Mrs. Grace's encouragement, Emily began taking small steps toward self-improvement. She used the little money she had saved to buy secondhand books and taught herself basic accounting and business skills. She stayed up late at night, studying by the dim light of a small lamp while Liam slept beside her. It wasn't easy. There were times when exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but she pushed through, driven by her determination to create a better future for her son. Emily also started experimenting with new recipes at the food stand, adding her own creative touches to the menu. Her dishes quickly became popular with the customers, and the food stand began to attract more business. Mrs. Grace was thrilled to see Emily's confidence grow and often praised her for her hard work and ingenuity. "You've got a real talent, Emily," Mrs. Grace said one day as they closed up the stand. "I wouldn't be surprised if you opened your own restaurant someday." The idea seemed impossible to Emily at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it began to feel like a dream worth pursuing. She started saving every extra penny she earned, setting it aside for the day when she could turn that dream into a reality. Of course, the journey wasn't without its setbacks. There were days when business was slow, and Emily worried about how she would make ends meet. There were times when Liam fell sick, and she had to spend sleepless nights caring for him, her heart aching with worry. But through it all, Emily never gave up. She had learned to face challenges head-on, to find solutions instead of dwelling on problems. Her resilience and determination didn't go unnoticed. The customers at the food stand often commented on how much she had grown, how she seemed stronger and more confident with each passing day. Some even began to spread the word about the food stand, bringing in new customers and helping the business thrive. One day, a regular customer, a kind-hearted woman who worked at a local community center, approached Emily with an offer. "We're starting a program to help young mothers like you learn new skills and find better job opportunities," she said. "I think you'd be a perfect fit." Emily hesitated at first, unsure if she could handle the additional responsibility, but with Mrs. Grace's encouragement, she decided to give it a try. The program turned out to be a turning point in her life. She learned valuable skills, made new connections, and gained the confidence to dream bigger. By the time Liam's first birthday came around, Emily's life had changed in ways she never thought possible. She was no longer the scared, lost girl who had wandered the streets with nowhere to go. She was a mother, a provider, and a fighter. She had built a stable life for herself and her son, and she was determined to keep moving forward. On Liam's birthday, Mrs. Grace surprised Emily with a small celebration at the food stand. There was a simple cake, a few balloons, and a handful of customers who had become like family. As Emily held Liam in her arms, watching him giggle and clap his tiny hands, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She looked at Mrs. Grace, her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. Mrs. Grace smiled, her own eyes glistening. "You did this, Emily. I just gave you a little push. The rest was all you." As Emily blew out the candle on Liam's cake, she made a silent wish for her son to grow up happy and healthy, and for her to continue building a life they could both be proud of. In that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same strength and determination that had brought her this far. For Liam and for herself, she would keep striving for success. Emily's journey of hard work and determination continued as she began to dream bigger for herself and her son. After months of working tirelessly at Mrs. Grace's food stand, Emily had not only mastered the art of cooking, but also developed a deep passion for it. Mrs. Grace, who had become both a mentor and a mother figure to Emily, noticed her growing confidence and encouraged her to take the next step. "You've got a real gift, Emily," Mrs. Grace said one evening as they cleaned up the stand after a busy day. "Your food brings people together. You should think about starting something of your own." The idea both excited and terrified Emily. She had always dreamed of doing something more, but the thought of running her own business seemed impossible. She didn't have much money, and the responsibilities of raising Liam as a single mother were already overwhelming. But Mrs. Grace's words stayed with her, and over time, the dream began to feel less like a fantasy and more like a goal she could work toward. Emily started small. With the little savings she had, she bought a second-hand cart and a few basic supplies. She set up her own food stand just a few streets away from Mrs. Grace's, selling simple but delicious meals she had perfected over the years. Mrs. Grace was her biggest supporter, helping her set up the stand and even lending her some of her own equipment to get started. The first few weeks were tough. Emily spent long hours preparing food, serving customers, and cleaning up, all while taking care of Liam. There were days when business was slow, and she worried about whether she had made the right decision, but she refused to give up. She poured her heart into her cooking, experimenting with new recipes and listening to feedback from her customers. Slowly but surely, word began to spread about the young woman with the incredible food and the warm smile. Customers started coming back, not just for the food, but also for Emily's kindness and determination. Her stand became a small but bustling hub of activity, with people lining up to try her dishes. She made it a point to remember her regulars, greeting them by name and making them feel welcome. Her food stand wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place where people felt at home. One day, a young woman named Sarah stopped by Emily's stand. Sarah was a successful entrepreneur in her late 20s, known for her sharp business sense and her love of supporting local talent. She had heard about Emily's food from a friend and decided to see what all the fuss was about. As soon as Sarah took her first bite, she was hooked. The flavors were rich and comforting, and it was clear that Emily had a natural talent for cooking. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became a regular customer, often stopping by to chat with Emily while enjoying her meals. One afternoon, as the lunch rush died down, Sarah approached Emily with a serious expression. "Your food is amazing, Emily," she said, setting her plate down on the counter. "Have you ever thought about opening a restaurant?" Emily froze, caught off guard by the question. She had dreamed of opening a restaurant for years, but it always felt like an impossible goal. She hesitated before replying. "I've dreamed of it, but I don't have the resources. It's just too big of a step for me right now." Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with determination. "Let me help you. I believe in you." Emily stared at her, unsure of what to say. She had grown so used to doing everything on her own that the idea of someone offering to help felt almost unreal. But there was something about Sarah's confidence and sincerity that made her want to believe it was possible. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Emily worked together to turn the dream into a reality. Sarah helped Emily secure a small loan and find a modest space to open her first restaurant. She also guided Emily through the process of setting up the business, from designing the menu to hiring staff. It was a whirlwind of activity, and there were moments when Emily felt completely overwhelmed. But with Sarah's support and Mrs. Grace's encouragement, she pushed through. The day the restaurant opened was one of the proudest moments of Emily's life. It was a small, cozy space with just a handful of tables, but it was hers. The walls were decorated with photos of her journey, from her days at Mrs. Grace's food stand to the opening of her own business. The menu featured all of her best dishes, each one crafted with love and care. The first few months were challenging as Emily adjusted to the demands of running a restaurant. There were long hours, unexpected setbacks, and moments of doubt. But the community rallied around her, drawn not just by her food, but by her story. Customers came from all over to support the young mother who had worked so hard to build a better life for herself and her son. As the restaurant grew in popularity, Emily began to dream even bigger. With Sarah's guidance, she started expanding the business, opening new locations in nearby neighborhoods. Each new restaurant carried the same warmth and authenticity as the first, with Emily's personal touch evident in every detail. Years passed, and Emily's small food stand grew into a thriving chain of restaurants. She became a well-known figure in the community, admired not just for her success, but for her resilience and generosity. She made it a point to give back, hiring young mothers and people in need, just as Mrs. Grace had once given her a chance. Through it all, Emily never forgot where she came from. She often visited Mrs. Grace, who had retired but still loved to hear about Emily's latest achievements. Liam, now a bright and curious boy, adored spending time with the woman who had been like a grandmother to him. One evening, as Emily stood in the kitchen of her flagship restaurant, watching her staff prepare meals for a packed dining room, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the people who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Sarah walked into the kitchen smiling as she handed Emily a glass of wine. "You've come a long way, Emily," she said. "I always knew you could do it." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, or Mrs. Grace, or Liam. It's been a team effort." As she looked around the bustling restaurant filled with laughter and the aroma of her signature dishes, Emily felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had built something beautiful, not just for herself, but for her son and for the community that had supported her every step of the way. And in that moment, she knew that the best was yet to come. One afternoon, like any other day, Emily's restaurant was bustling with activity. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, blending with the aroma of her signature dishes. She stood behind the counter, her hands moving quickly as she checked the dishes before they were served. Despite the busyness, Emily always wore a smile, knowing that everything she had today was the result of her relentless efforts. But today was not an ordinary day. Something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change her life forever. As Emily was focused on her work, the door to the restaurant opened quietly. An older woman, frail and hesitant, stepped inside. She wore a worn-out coat, and her eyes carried a mix of worry and regret. She stood at the entrance as if unsure whether to take another step. Emily looked up, and her eyes met the woman's. Time seemed to stop. Her heart pounded as she immediately recognized the woman, even after all these years. It was her mother. The mother who had turned her back on her when she was just 15, pregnant and with nowhere to go. The mother she had once loved deeply but had also resented for so long. Now, standing before her, this woman looked so much older, her face lined with wrinkles that seemed to tell a story of pain and remorse. The older woman took slow, tentative steps toward Emily. Her eyes glistened with tears, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I was wrong to turn my back on you. I shouldn't have done that. I just want to see you and my grandson again." The restaurant seemed to fall silent. The staff and nearby customers paused, their attention drawn to the emotional scene unfolding before them. Emily stood frozen, unable to speak. Memories of the past came flooding back. The day she was cast out of her home, the cold nights on the streets, and the countless tears she had shed in loneliness and despair. But then, she also remembered the people who had helped her, the lessons she had learned along the way. She thought of Jack, the homeless man who had shared his last sandwich with her. She thought of Mrs. Grace, who had given her a job and believed in her. And she thought of Sarah, who had helped her turn her dreams into reality. All of them had taught her about forgiveness, compassion, and the power of love. Tears streamed down Emily's face. She looked at her mother, who no longer seemed like the stern, unyielding woman she remembered, but rather a mother filled with regret and longing for redemption. Taking a deep breath, Emily finally spoke, her voice choked with emotion. "Mom, I was so angry at you for so long. I thought I could never forgive you. But through everything I've been through, I've learned that everyone makes mistakes. I forgive you." Her mother broke down in tears, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Emily stepped forward and embraced her tightly. The years of pain and distance melted away in that moment, as mother and daughter held each other, crying together. As they hugged, a small voice piped up from behind them. "Mommy, who is this?" Emily turned to see Liam, her little boy, standing there with wide, curious eyes. He was about 6 years old, with soft brown hair and an innocent smile. Kneeling down, Emily gently said, "Liam, this is your grandmother." Liam looked at the older woman for a moment, then broke into a bright smile. He ran over and wrapped his arms around both Emily and his grandmother. The older woman wept again, this time tears of joy, as she held her grandson for the first time. "My grandson," she whispered, stroking Liam's hair. "I've missed so much, but now, I just want to make it up to you and him." The scene touched everyone in the restaurant. A few customers quietly wiped away tears, while the staff looked on with warm smiles. It was a beautiful moment, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring bond of family. From that day on, Emily and her mother began to rebuild their relationship. Her mother started visiting the restaurant regularly, helping Emily care for Liam and even assisting with small tasks in the kitchen. She told Liam stories about their family, about Emily's childhood, and about the lessons she had learned from her mistakes. Though Emily still carried some scars from the past, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She realized that forgiveness wasn't just a gift for others, it was also a gift for herself. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Emily, her mother, and Liam sat together in the small kitchen. They shared a simple meal, but the room was filled with laughter and love. "I'm so proud of you, Emily," her mother said, holding her hand. "You've become such a strong, incredible woman. Thank you for giving me the chance to be your mother again." Emily smiled, looking at her mother and her son. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she no longer felt alone. She had her family by her side, and she understood that love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. In the warm glow of the kitchen, 3 generations sat together, sharing a moment they would treasure forever. The evening was calm, and the warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows of Emily's cozy home. Inside, the dining table was set with care, adorned with simple but heartfelt touches, a vase of fresh flowers, neatly folded napkins, and dishes filled with the delicious food Emily had prepared. The room was filled with the soft hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter, a testament to the love and connection that had grown between the people gathered there. At the head of the table sat Mrs. Grace, her kind eyes sparkling as she watched the scene unfold. She had been a pillar of support for Emily during her darkest days, and now, seeing Emily's success and happiness, she couldn't help but feel proud. Beside her was Jack, the man who had once shared his last sandwich with a desperate young girl. His weathered face bore a gentle smile, and his eyes reflected the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen life at its worst and still found reasons to hope. Emily's mother sat next to Jack, her hands resting on her lap as she looked around the table. Her face, lined with age and regret, now softened with gratitude. She had been given a second chance to be part of her daughter's life, and she cherished every moment of it. Across from her sat Liam, Emily's 6-year-old son, his laughter filling the room as he told a story about his day at school. His innocence and joy were a reminder of how far Emily had come and how much she had fought to give him a better life. At the center of it all was Emily, moving between the kitchen and the table, making sure everyone had enough to eat. She wore a simple apron over her clothes, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face glowed with happiness, a reflection of the peace she had found after years of struggle. As she placed a steaming dish of roasted vegetables on the table, she paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the people she loved most in the world gathered together. The conversation flowed easily, filled with stories of the past and dreams for the future. Mrs. Grace shared tales of her younger days, her voice animated as she recounted the challenges and triumphs of running her food stand. Jack chimed in with his own stories, his deep voice carrying a sense of humor that had everyone laughing. Emily's mother, though quieter, occasionally added her own memories, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and a hint of sadness for the years she had lost. Liam, ever curious, asked Jack about his life before he met Emily. Jack smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, kiddo," he said, "life wasn't always easy. But sometimes, when you're at your lowest, you meet someone who reminds you that there's still good in the world. For me, that person was your mom." Emily looked at Jack, her eyes glistening with tears. "And for me, it was you," she said softly. "You gave me hope when I had none." Jack waved a hand dismissively, though his smile grew wider. "Ah, I just shared a sandwich. You're the one who did all the hard work." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. Then Mrs. Grace raised her glass, her voice steady and full of emotion. "To Emily," she said, "to her strength, her kindness, and her ability to inspire everyone around her." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the toast. Emily blushed, her cheeks turning a soft shade of pink. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you. You've all been my family when I had no one else, and for that, I'll always be grateful." As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Liam entertained everyone with his impressions of his teachers, while Mrs. Grace teased Jack about his cooking skills, or lack thereof. Emily's mother, though still reserved, laughed along with the others, her heart slowly healing with each shared moment. After dinner, the group moved to the living room where they sat together on the couch and armchairs. Liam climbed onto his grandmother's lap, his small hands playing with the wrinkles on her hands. "Grandma," he said, his voice full of curiosity, "why did you and Mommy not talk for so long?" The room grew quiet, the question hanging in the air. Emily's mother looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with regret. "Because I made a mistake," she said softly. "I was scared and didn't know how to handle things, but I've learned that it's never too late to say you're sorry and try to make things right." Emily reached over and placed a hand on her mother's. "And it's never too late to forgive," she said, her voice steady. "We've both learned a lot, and now we have a chance to move forward together." Liam nodded, as if he understood more than his young age would suggest. He leaned his head against his grandmother's shoulder, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. Emily smiled, her heart full as she watched her son and her mother together. Later that night, after everyone had left and Liam was tucked into bed, Emily stood in the doorway of her home, looking out at the quiet street. The stars twinkled above, and the cool night air carried a sense of peace. She thought about how far she had come, from a scared, abandoned teenager to a successful businesswoman and a loving mother. Her journey had been anything but easy, but every challenge had shaped her into the person she was today. The next morning, Emily stood outside her restaurant, holding Liam in her arms. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the building. The sign above the door bore her name, a symbol of everything she had built. She looked down at her son, who was still half asleep, his head resting on her shoulder. Then she looked out at the street, her heart swelling with gratitude. A smile spread across her face as she whispered to herself, "No matter how hard life gets, as long as you don't give up, you'll find the light at the end of the tunnel." The camera panned out, capturing the image of Emily and Liam standing in front of the restaurant, the morning light bathing them in warmth. The screen faded to black, and the words appeared, "No matter how hard life gets, as long as you don't give up, you'll find the light at the end of the tunnel." And with that, Emily's story came to a close, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities.